speaker. Professor Dr. Liaquat Ali is the last speaker. And unfortunately, I think that I have to restrict the question answer session because we are running late. Professor Liaquat Ali is a biomedical scientist and academician with deep interest in physiological, socio-cultural, and literary affairs. He's a medical graduate from University of Dhaka with MPhil in medical biochemistry from the same university and PhD in medical cell biology from Uppsala University, Sweden. He's widely published, and he's a public health advisor. He is also actively involved to promote health education among the public and policymakers through various mass media. In addition to his contribution in his professional field, Professor Ali is also known as a leading socio-cultural and literary activist in Bangladesh. He is a founding chair of Puthikrit Foundation, which operates a popular intellectually oriented cultural center, Sanskriti Bikash Kendra, or SBK in Dhaka. And he will be talking about the title of his talk is Ethical Consequences of COVID-19 Pandemic. Over to Professor Dr. Liaquat Ali.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Bangladesh. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can. We can, Professor.
But okay. Thank you. First of all, my deep regards to the organizers for inviting me to this important webinar. In fact, I'm little deviating from medicine and health, and the topic I am discussing, actually our respected Professor Sinwari has excellently introduced this before, and this is a recurrent issue because like the COVID-19 itself, there is a great challenge underlying all the health and economic challenges. And I think this is a recurrent challenge. Human civilization has been facing this challenge from earlier days. About 2005 years back, Socrates was telling in a dialogue by Plato in Meno that what is virtue? And in fact, this has been asked again and again in human history. And underlying all health and economic and social challenges, this ethical or moral challenge is a great one. And we are facing it again during this pandemic. Actually, there are many issues supported by or solved by law, but sometimes we have faced dilemmas which cannot be solved by law all the time. And there are justified dilemmas in the ethical decision-making process. For example, if we take the example of the healthcare providers and we take physicians as examples, for example, in this particular time, we can see that there is a dilemma between the moral values of duty-based and right-based moral values. How? Because as a duty, when we take the Hippocratic Oath, the physicians, we are bound to serve the patient at any cost, at any time. That is our primary duty. And also by some religious and other ideals, we are also bound by duty, even if we die. But in another moral value, there are right-based values also. Every human being has a right to live, and also they have to take the care of their near and dear ones. So in this particular dilemma, you cannot really say this is better or that is bad. And this has been compounded by situations like that prevailed in the earliest days in Bangladesh during this pandemic. And I think that happened in many, many countries in the world, in most of the countries, developing countries in the world, that there were shortages of personal protective equipment. So the patients, providers were not well protected. And in even hospitals, the environment was not very friendly. So actually this duty versus right created a dilemma because the physicians are also human beings. They have to go back to their families, and the family members will be at stake. And that happened. Actually, in Bangladesh, particularly, the proportion of doctors dying out of this pandemic is much greater than the general population. So as you see that this right of preservation of self and family members are also an ethical issue, and that is a justified ethical issue. And then there are other situations, if we look beyond this, in this particular dilemma, actually in general, not every in every case, but in general, the duty-based ethics prevailed. And in fact, as I said before, many of the physicians gave their life disproportionately in terms of others. There are also other dilemmas which we had to face, the providers. As a doctor, we had to take decision, or as a policymaker, we had to face this dilemma, because there are shortage, there are absolute crises, and still there are, for say oxygens, say high flow nasal cannulas, or say ventilators or ICU beds. And now, if we see an old patient with a comorbidity like cardiac problem or uncontrolled diabetes, and we know that the chance of that patient is much higher to die compared to a younger patient who has no comorbidity and who is whose possibility to be back to life is much higher. But if there is one bed, how to choose that? Then that is a rationing issue, and that's the rationing of the life-saving measures. The decision had to be taken by the physician or the policymaker or the managers. So that was a very problematic dilemma, and there is no law which can save it. So actually, the legal framework is not sufficient to solve this dilemma, and there were certain ethical or moral values which had to be applied. Now, I have given an example only because time is very short, so we'll just go quickly. There are, say, other traditional debates coming through this from this pandemic. We have seen so many examples in social media, in mainstream media, about human beings behaving like animals, even sons and daughters leaving parents, or people getting unattended. Even the dead bodies were not attended, even by religious rules were not honored, etc., by families, by social groups. We have seen that. But the another traditional debates actually coming from the ethical issue, that there were fundamental ethical schools, like say utility-based ethical school, where the so-called the utilitarian ethics is prevailing in a Western democratic society, greatest happiness for the greatest good. And as I have said, there are duty-based, which is coming either from religion or other non-religious duty-based ethics, or right-based ethics, where every person has certain human rights, as you said. So there are different kind of schools, and those schools are now in question, because if you look at the utilitarian concept of greatest happiness for the greatest beings in Western democracy, we have seen so many problems during this pandemic, even in Western democratic environment, which is sometimes demanding rather duty-based ethics. Sometimes this is contradicting with right-based ethics. And actually, we had an illusion in the last century, from the beginning of the last century, that illusion grew and grew about the neoliberal ethical principles, which actually demanded that the market itself is a good judge, and market itself balances the evils, and market itself really corrects and globalization will help in extending the benefits of the human beings. But what we saw during the pandemic is actually that's not a fact. That's an illusion. Rather, globalization sometimes brought very negative impacts on the whole welfare of the human beings, and this did not really evenly distributed. This is not a judge by itself unless certain external values are put forward. and who Professor Sinwari has given excellent examples that who are the worst sufferers of the pandemic. Actually, the poorer and marginalized people, poorer in terms of wealth, in terms of society, in terms of refugee, in terms of gender, many examples. And actually, they are forming major bulk of the world population. If we look at this, the consequence we can see that rather the health and socioeconomic inequality in the world has increased, injustice has increased. And he has given example in the USA. I can say even in Bangladesh, the richer has become richer, poorer have become poorer, and I believe this is almost similar in many countries. Actually, the inequality and health and wealth have greatly increased all over the world, and that is a consequence of the not only pandemic, it is underlying ethical values which has shaped our civilization. And where when we boast about our civilization, we have to ask really whether we have progressed ethically or just by economic and other means. So we also saw the different approaches, actually liberal approaches, which I already told that the neoliberal economy philosophy, and then attached the market economy or liberal economy. If we look at those countries, they were relatively unsuccessful in controlling the pandemic. Actually, that was more compatible with certain traditional ethical principles like autonomy, freedom of speech, etc., etc. But when we look at the outcome of the control of the pandemic, sometimes they were relatively unsuccessful, and that accompanied a great suffering on health, on nutrition, on economic and social consequences were sometimes not very favorable. And if we look at another approach, which is neither liberal, that is absolutely populist approach. There are, I mean, I'm not naming the country for obvious reasons, but you can imagine, or you can reflect by a little reflection, you can guess what we are meaning. There were so many populist approaches which led to utter failure and is still leading to utter failure. We have now burning examples now in all of the in some parts of the world, and not far. So we know that the populist approaches are utter failure. Then there were certain authoritarian approaches. In many terms, that those were authoritarians, and they were relatively more successful in controlling the pandemic. But that raises fundamental ethical issues related to human dignity, freedom, and autonomy. And actually, Professor Sinwari, in the last part of his lecture, he mentioned about the freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and also privacy, also tracking, and many other violation of the fundamental ethical principles. So whether this is by authoritarian or popular approaches, actually sometimes that has been used, the pandemic has been used to justify certain ideological platforms and dogmas. Again, I'm not naming, but you can easily imagine not only maltreatment like hydroxychloroquine or say other drugs which are not really proved, but many other even ideological platforms, dogmas that has been promoted during this pandemic. This is by very influential people, even heads of the states. And this has brought into a very recurrent question in human history. What is the role of the individual? What is the role of the state? What is the purview of this individual? What is the purview of the state? And we need to rethink, and we need to get out of the ideas of the last centuries that it is only the freedom of the individuals or absolute control of the states. This does not work, and we have gained a lot of experience during this. We have to have a balance. We have to have a midway, and how that can be done, we need to discuss. In the last part, actually, again, we have heard from Professor Sinwari regarding health research and dissemination. In fact, we are facing some basic questions because some of the age-old scientific and moral rigorosity which we developed over the centuries, we had to sacrifice during this pandemic. We had to, the regulatory authorities approved certain protocols without rigorous, review. The steps were bypassed, and there were certain steps which does not go with the traditional moral values. But that is an urgent need of the humanity, what to do. That was a moral dilemma, ethical dilemma, but we have passed a certain critical stage. Now we have to rethink if something happens in future, how to handle it. There were hasty clinical trials, there were proposal challenge about challenge state studies and non-compliance to Helsinki Declaration. But I think this should not go on forever. And for dissemination also, without validation or there were non-peer-reviewed publications, press briefings, preprints, and sometimes these press briefings were by very influential people who are not really scientists, but promoting bad science and imposing bad science. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think the health research and dissemination, everything suffered from ethical diversion in the current pandemic. And so in conclusion, actually critical discussion and working consensus on ethical issues have now become urgent for future advancement of healthcare and biomedical research. And I think Pakistan Academy of Sciences, ASA, IAP, and all other concerned people should come forward because I think we need definitely vaccines, we need other commodities to fight, we need other regulations to fight this pandemic. But underlying all levels, there are ethical issues which we should also work together. And that is not devoid of politics, that is not devoid of philosophy, that everything comes together, and scientists should not detach themselves. Scientists should not become technocrats. They should be responsible people serving the whole human community as a whole. So with this, I would like to thank you again for inviting me for this meeting. Thank you very much.